What if the past holds the blueprints for our future?
Welcome to History and Predictions.
The story of the British Empire is the story of modernity itself, a centuries-long saga of ambition, innovation, relentless expansion, and ultimately, retreat, leaving an indelible mark upon the political, economic, and cultural geography of the entire world. It began not with grand strategy, but with opportunistic privateers, ambitious merchants, and a small, damp island nation eager to compete with the established continental powers of Spain and Portugal, who had carved up the New World between them. In the late 16th century, under the reign of Elizabeth I, English involvement in global exploration was often characterized by piracy and raiding, a proto-imperialism driven less by colonization and more by the desire to snatch treasure from Spanish galleons. This era fostered the maritime skills and naval dominance that would become the backbone of the empire. Key early ventures included the attempts to establish settlements in North America, such as the disastrous Roanoke colony, which, despite its failure, signaled a hunger for overseas footholds. It was the joint stock company, however, that provided the crucial financial engine for sustained expansion, mitigating the massive risk associated with long-distance trade and settlement. The founding of the Virginia Company in 1606 and the subsequent establishment of Jamestown marked the true beginning of the First British Empire, focused primarily on the Americas and the West Indies. The 17th century saw a rapid acceleration of colonization. In North America, settlements spread from Virginia up the eastern seaboard, populated by a complex mix of religious dissenters seeking freedom, indentured servants seeking opportunity, and, tragically, enslaved Africans forcibly transported across the brutal Middle Passage. This burgeoning empire was fundamentally mercantile, based on the extraction of raw materials, sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from the Chesapeake, which were shipped back to Britain and processed or re-exported, locking the colonies into a dependency that fueled the mother country's wealth. In the West Indies, colonies like Barbados and Jamaica quickly became the jewels of the empire due to the enormous profitability of sugar, a crop cultivated entirely through the horrific system of chattel slavery. This dependency on enslaved labor became an essential, if morally abhorrent, component of imperial wealth accumulation, underpinning the growth of ports like Bristol and Liverpool. Simultaneously, a parallel but distinct path of expansion was unfolding in the East. The British East India Company, established in 1600, was a purely commercial entity intended to challenge Dutch dominance in the spice trade. It began with trading posts in Surat, Madras, and Calcutta, relying on the permission of local rulers, particularly the Mughal emperors. Unlike the settler colonies in the West, the initial phase in the East was about commerce, not conquest. Yet the seeds of future political control were already sown in the establishment of fortified factories and the maintenance of small private armies. The rise of company power in India was not planned, but rather a reaction to the decline of the Mughal Empire and the need to protect commercial interests from French competitors. The mid-18th century proved to be a pivotal watershed, marked by a series of global conflicts, most notably the 7 Years' War, 1756–1763. This war, often called the True First World War, fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Britain decisively defeated France, stripping them of nearly all their North American territories, including Canada, and confirming British paramountcy in India. Victories like Robert Clive's at Plassey in 1757 effectively turned the British East India Company from a trading organization into the sovereign power over Bengal, an area richer and more populous than Britain itself. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 left Britain as the undisputed master of a vast and geographically sprawling empire. However, this triumph was short-lived, as the very mercantilist policies designed to finance the immense debt accrued during the war led to catastrophic internal friction. Attempts by London to directly tax the American colonies, which had enjoyed a high degree of self-governance, ignited the Revolutionary War. The loss of the 13 colonies in 1783 was a massive blow, shattering the core of the First Empire and forcing a fundamental shift in imperial philosophy. The lessons learned were harsh. Direct rule and heavy taxation of settler communities were politically unsustainable. This setback did not halt the imperial project. Rather, it redirected it, The focus of colonization shifted eastward and southward. The acquisition of Canada, the expansion in India, and the new settlement of Australia, beginning in 1788 as a penal colony, defined the trajectory of the Second British Empire. In India, the period following the American loss saw the consolidation of company rule, moving from simple governance to outright conquest and annexation of numerous princely states. By the early 1800s, figures like Lord Wellesley systematically expanded British territory, creating a complex system of direct rule and indirect control over subordinate allies. Simultaneously, the Napoleonic Wars 1803–1815 provided an opportunity for further naval supremacy and strategic acquisitions. Britain seized key naval bases and trading points from France and its allies, including Malta, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Cape Colony in South Africa. The victory at Waterloo cemented Britain's position as the world's leading naval and economic power, ushering in the period of relative global peace known as the Pax Britannica. The 19th century, the era of Queen Victoria, marked the true zenith of the British Empire, transforming it from a collection of coastal settlements into a vast, sprawling, contiguous landmass often referred to as the empire on which the sun never sets. This expansion was powered by the unmatched force of the Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain. Factories demanded raw materials, cotton from India and Egypt, rubber from Malaya, tin from Burma, and in return, the colonies became captive markets for British manufactured goods. Technological superiority, particularly in steam power, both on land and at sea, the invention of the telegraph, and the development of modern weaponry gave Britain a decisive, sometimes brutal, advantage over indigenous resistance. The internal administration of the empire also underwent a crucial transformation following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, often called the Sepoy Mutiny. This uprising, the most serious challenge to British rule in the East, led to the dissolution of the East India Company and the direct assumption of governance by the British Crown. The subsequent proclamation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India in 1877 formalized a new era of direct imperial prestige and administration, based on the principles of racial hierarchy and the paternalistic notion of the white man's burden, the idea that it was the moral duty of the British to civilize and govern the backward peoples of the world. Second half of the 19th century witnessed the infamous scramble for Africa, driven by economic interests, strategic rivalry with other European powers, especially Germany and France, and the newly discovered medical means to combat tropical diseases. Britain plunged into the interior of the African continent. Figures like Cecil Rhodes pursued a vision of a continuous British territory stretching Cape to Cairo. This period saw the forceful annexation of vast territories, the establishment of protectorates, and the drawing of arbitrary borders that ignored existing ethnic and linguistic divisions, planting the seeds of future conflict. Colonies such as Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt, formerly autonomous but controlled via a debt protectorate, became integral parts of the global system. By 1900, the British Empire governed approximately 1/4 of the world's land surface and 1/4 of its population, ruling over 400 million people. The nature of the empire had solidified into two main types: the White Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and eventually South Africa, which were granted a large degree of self-governance and enjoyed status closer to the mother country, and the vast network of crown colonies, protectorates, and India, which were ruled directly by British officials with little to no representation for the native populations. Yet, even at its apparent zenith, the first structural cracks were beginning to show. The Boer Wars, 1899–1902 in South Africa, fought against Dutch settlers resisting British annexation, proved unexpectedly costly, generating domestic dissent and revealing the brutal lengths required to maintain control over unwilling populations. The rise of industrial competitors, particularly Germany and the United States, began to erode Britain's economic dominance. The reliance on the Navy for global free trade was increasingly challenged by German naval expansion, leading directly to the escalating tensions that culminated in the First World War. When the Great War erupted in 1914, the empire rallied, supplying millions of soldiers, laborers, and vast quantities of materials from every corner of the globe. Indian soldiers fought in the trenches of France, Australian, and New Zealand forces, landed at Gallipoli, and African regiments served in campaigns against German colonies. This massive contribution, however, had an unforeseen consequence. It provided a platform for colonial subjects to realize their own value and sacrifice, empowering nascent nationalist movements with moral authority and political experience. The sacrifices made were often not rewarded with greater freedom, leading to immediate post-war tensions, such as the Amritsar massacre in India in 1919. The interwar period, 1918 to 1939, was one of contradictory imperial activity. On the one hand, Britain gained new territories under League of Nations mandates, essentially consolidating control over former Ottoman lands, including Palestine and Iraq, which only further complicated its imperial burden by involving it in the complex politics of the Middle East. On the other hand, the Statute of Westminster in 1931 granted the White Dominions full legislative independence, formalizing a gradual move toward a voluntary association, the Commonwealth, rather than direct subordination. In India, Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent resistance movement gained immense global traction, placing relentless moral pressure on the British Raj. The economic downturn of the Great Depression forced Britain to retreat from its long-held policy of global free trade, establishing the imperial preference system, which prioritized trade within the empire, a defensive measure that underscored the erosion of its former global economic supremacy. The Second World War, 1939-1945, proved to be the decisive terminal blow. Although Britain ultimately stood victorious, the war shattered the core foundations of the empire. Key strategic defeats, particularly the fall of Singapore to the Japanese in 1942, demonstrated that the supposed invincibility and racial superiority of the British were a myth. The war bankrupted Britain, forcing it to rely heavily on American aid, like Lend-Lease, and leaving it deeply indebted. Post-war, the international landscape was dominated by two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, both of whom were ideologically opposed to traditional European colonialism. The post-war Labour government, facing economic ruin at home, was politically and financially unable to resist the surging tide of self-determination. The promise of freedom and the massive economic costs of maintaining an empire led to the inevitable conclusion: rapid, phased withdrawal. The process of decolonization began dramatically and irreversibly with the independence and partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. This transfer of power was marred by immense violence and tragedy, but signaled the definitive end of the jewel in the crown. Over the next 2 decades, the dominoes fell rapidly across Asia and Africa. Burma and Ceylon gained independence shortly after India. In Africa, the 1950s saw the beginnings of organized resistance, culminating in the Year of Africa in 1960, when 17 nations, many of them British territories, achieved independence. The watershed moment symbolizing the loss of British global authority was the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Britain and France, in collusion with Israel, attempted to seize back the Suez Canal after its nationalization by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, they were met with immediate and overwhelming condemnation from both the United States and the Soviet Union. The subsequent humiliating withdrawal demonstrated definitively that Britain could no longer act independently as a global superpower, relying instead on the tacit approval of Washington. The crisis served as a brutal, public affirmation of imperial decline. The 1960s were characterized by a managed retreat. Harold Macmillan's 1960 Wind of Change speech acknowledged the unstoppable force of African nationalism. While some transitions were relatively peaceful, Ghana, Kenya, others were marked by insurgency and counterinsurgency, most notably the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, which revealed the dark, often brutal underbelly of the maintenance of colonial control. The final decades of the 20th century saw the slow, often complicated process of granting independence to smaller island colonies and territories. The handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997, marking the end of a 99-year lease, is widely regarded by historians as the symbolic, if not the actual final sunset of the British Empire. This moment represented the last major population group to transition from British rule, closing a chapter that spanned more than 3 centuries. In the aftermath, the former empire transformed into the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of sovereign states linked by history, language, and shared institutions. This organization, though lacking the coercive power of the old empire, retains a role in international diplomacy and cooperation, serving as a testament to the enduring, complex legacy. The effects of the empire are vast and contradictory. It bequeathed a common language, English, parliamentary democracy, a globalized legal framework, and infrastructure to many nations, but also left behind economic dependency, political instability due to arbitrarily drawn borders, and a profound, often traumatic psychological legacy of exploitation, racial hierarchy, and cultural suppression. The wealth generated by the empire fundamentally transformed Britain itself, underwriting the Industrial Revolution and shaping its political institutions, but the moral cost of slavery and colonial oppression remains an inescapable part of its historical accounting. Today, the debate over the empire continues, a complex reckoning with its triumphs and atrocities, its innovations, and its destructive force, a historical phenomenon that defined the global order and the lives of billions, an extraordinary and paradoxical enterprise whose rise and fall continue to shape the contours of the 21st century world.